The morning started like any other at Chicago O'Hare International Airport. The January air was crisp, and passengers of Flight AA 2437 to Los Angeles were settling into their seats, most of them looking forward to escaping the Midwest winter for California's warm embrace. Among them was a woman in seat 23C, dressed in a navy business suit that looked slightly wrinkled, as if she'd been wearing it for days. At first glance, there was nothing remarkable about her. She could have been any of the countless professionals who filled the skies between major cities every day. Her carry-on bag was properly stowed, her seatbelt fastened, and she even smiled politely at the flight attendant during the safety demonstration. Yet something about her demeanor caught the attention of the passenger in 23D. The way her fingers drummed restlessly against her armrest, how her eyes kept darting between her phone and the cabin door. 30 minutes after takeoff, as the plane reached its cruising altitude and the seatbelt signs dinged off, things began to change. The woman's composed facade started to crack. Her breathing became more rapid, and beads of sweat formed on her forehead despite the cool cabin air. She pulled out her phone again, jabbing at it frantically even though everyone knew phones had to be in airplane mode. A young flight attendant noticed and approached with a gentle reminder about the phone policy. "I understand," the woman said, her voice tight with barely contained emotion. "But you don't understand. This can't wait." Her knuckles were white around the phone, as if it contained secrets too heavy to bear. Other passengers were starting to notice now. A businessman paused his movie, earbuds dangling. A mother pulled her curious toddler closer. The woman stood suddenly, her movements jerky and uncertain, like a puppet pulled by invisible strings. She began pacing the narrow aisle, phone still clutched in her hand, muttering numbers and codes that made no sense to anyone else. 2 more flight attendants approached, their professional smiles masking growing concern. "Ma'am," one began, "we need you to return to your seat." But the woman shook her head, her eyes wild with a desperate kind of knowledge. "You have to turn the plane around," she insisted, her voice rising. "There's something you all need to know." The tension in the cabin was palpable now. Some passengers were filming discreetly with their phones, while others pretended to be absorbed in their books or screens, stealing glances when they thought no one was looking. A child whispered too loudly, "Mommy, why is that lady acting scary?" The head flight attendant appeared, her experienced eyes quickly assessing the situation. As she approached, the woman's behavior became even more agitated. "Please," she begged, "just check the other flight. Check 2891. There's still time." Her words echoed through the suddenly quiet cabin, leaving passengers wondering what could possibly be so urgent that it would drive a seemingly normal person to such desperation. Little did anyone on that flight realize that this apparent disruption was just the beginning of a story that would soon make headlines across the world, expose dangerous security flaws, and change aviation protocols forever. In that moment, though, they were just witnesses to what seemed like another unfortunate air rage incident, one of many that plague modern air travel. The woman's face showed a complex mix of emotions: fear, determination, and something else. A burning urgency that seemed to radiate from her very being. As she continued to resist the flight attendant's attempts to calm her, it became clear to everyone on board that this flight was about to take an unexpected turn, one that would lead them all into territory far more complex than a simple case of passenger misconduct. The atmosphere in the cabin grew heavier with each passing minute. What had started as a minor disruption was quickly evolving into something more serious. The woman's breathing had become more erratic, and her eyes darted around the cabin as if searching for invisible enemies. Her business suit, which had looked merely wrinkled before, now hung awkwardly on her frame as she continued to pace. "Please, you don't understand," she kept saying, her voice growing more desperate. "We can't wait 3 more hours. People's lives are at stake." The passengers exchanged worried glances. A teenager in the back row stopped playing his video game, his headphones hanging loosely around his neck as he watched the scene unfold. The lead flight attendant, a veteran of 15 years in the sky, had seen her share of difficult passengers. But something about this woman was different. There was no smell of alcohol, no signs of substance abuse. Instead, there was an almost electric intensity about her, like someone carrying the weight of terrible knowledge. "Ma'am," the flight attendant tried again, her voice calm but firm. "Whatever the situation is, we can help you better if you return to your seat. Let's talk about this quietly." She gestured to an empty row near the back of the plane, hoping to move the situation away from the other passengers. But the woman shook her head vigorously. "You need to radio the ground crew right now. Flight 2891, they need to check the passenger manifest. Something's wrong with the system." Her voice cracked with urgency, and she pulled out her phone again, fingers trembling as she tried to override the airplane mode. A businessman in first class stood up, trying to help. "Listen, I'm sure whatever it is can wait until we land. Why don't you?" But before he could finish, the woman cut him off. "No, you don't get it. By then, it'll be too late." Her sudden outburst caused a baby in row 15 to start crying, its wails adding to the tension. The situation reached a breaking point when the woman suddenly turned and started moving toward the cockpit. Her steps were determined, almost mechanical, as if she were forcing herself to move against her own better judgment. "I need to speak to the pilot," she announced. "They'll understand when I explain." That's when two air marshals revealed themselves. They had been watching the situation develop, and now they moved with swift, professional efficiency. The first one, a broad-shouldered man with kind eyes, stepped into the aisle. "Ma'am, stop right there," he said firmly but gently. His partner, shorter but equally alert, positioned herself to block any escape routes. The woman froze, her face a mask of frustration and despair. "Please," she whispered, but her voice carried in the hushed cabin. "I'm trying to prevent a catastrophe. Just check the system. Check the patterns in the bookings. It's all there if you know where to look." The air marshals moved closer, their movements careful and measured. The woman didn't resist as they took her arms, but tears started rolling down her cheeks. "I'm not crazy," she insisted, looking around at the sea of faces watching her. "I know how this looks, but I'm not crazy. Lives are at stake." Some passengers filmed the scene on their phones, while others looked away, uncomfortable with the raw emotion on display. A young girl tugged on her mother's sleeve, asking in a stage whisper why the lady was crying. The mother just pulled her daughter closer, murmuring quiet reassurances. As the air marshals guided the woman toward the back of the plane, she remained surprisingly composed, almost as if a switch had been flipped. "You'll see," she said quietly, her voice carrying in the silent cabin. "When you check Flight 2891, you'll understand. Just make sure you check it in time." The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing they would be making an unscheduled landing in Denver. A collective groan went up from the passengers, but it was mixed with relief. Whatever was happening, it would soon be someone else's problem to solve. Little did they know that this disrupted flight was about to uncover something far more sinister than anyone could have imagined. As the plane began its descent into Denver, none of the passengers realized they were witnessing not just a disturbance, but the first act of a story that would soon grip the nation's attention. The captain's voice came over the intercom again, steady and professional. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our descent into Denver International Airport. Please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts." The plane banked left, and through the windows, passengers could see the afternoon sun glinting off the Rocky Mountains. In the back of the plane, the woman sat quietly between the two air marshals. Her earlier panic had been replaced by an eerie calm that somehow felt more unsettling than her previous outburst. She kept checking her watch, as if counting down to something only she knew about. A flight attendant moved through the cabin, making sure everyone was buckled in. The young girl who had been watching everything unfold pressed her face against the window, pointing excitedly at the snow-capped peaks below. Her mother smiled weakly, still rattled by the events of the past hour. "Do you think we'll miss our connecting flights?" someone asked loudly. The question sparked a wave of murmurs through the cabin. People started pulling out their phones, ready to turn them on the moment they landed. A businessman sighed heavily, rescheduling meetings in his head. Two college students whispered about having to miss their campus tour. The descent felt different from a normal landing. The plane was coming down faster than usual, though not alarmingly so. Every bump of turbulence made passengers grip their armrests a little tighter. The cabin crew's faces remained professionally neutral, but their quick, efficient movements betrayed a sense of urgency. Through the windows, the airport came into view. Even passengers who had flown frequently noticed something unusual. They were being directed to a remote part of the airfield, away from the regular gates. As they got closer to the ground, they could see emergency vehicles waiting on the tarmac, their lights flashing silently in the afternoon sun. The landing itself was smooth, a testament to the pilot's skill. As the plane taxied to a stop, everyone could see the lineup of police cars, airport security vehicles, and what looked like federal agents waiting outside. The sight made everything suddenly feel very real. The captain's voice came over the intercom one last time. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain in your seats with your seatbelts fastened until further notice. We have some security personnel who need to board the aircraft." A tense silence fell over the cabin. The woman in custody straightened her posture, as if preparing herself. "Remember," she said quietly to the air marshal beside her, "Flight 2891. The pattern is there. Please make sure someone checks it." The cabin door opened, and 3 men in dark suits boarded, followed by airport police. They moved with practiced efficiency, heading straight to the back of the plane. The passengers watched in tense silence, many filming discreetly with their phones. What happened next surprised everyone. Instead of the dramatic arrest scene some had expected, the woman stood calmly when approached. "I'll cooperate fully," she said, her voice clear and steady. "But first, you need to check the manifest for Flight 2891. There's still time to prevent it." One of the suited men paused, something in her tone making him take notice. He gestured to his colleague, who immediately stepped aside and began speaking quietly into a phone. The woman nodded, as if satisfied that at least someone was finally listening. As they led her off the plane, she held her head high, nothing like the agitated person who had caused such chaos earlier. Several passengers later reported that she looked almost relieved, as if a heavy burden had been lifted from her shoulders. The remaining passengers sat in confused silence, watching through the windows as she was escorted to one of the waiting vehicles. The young girl who had been watching everything turned to her mother and asked, "What do you think she knew about the other plane?" Her question hung in the air, giving voice to what everyone was wondering. Something about the woman's certainty, her desperation to be heard, and her calm surrender had left them all with an uneasy feeling. Maybe, just maybe, there was more to this story than a simple case of air rage. None of them could have guessed that in less than an hour, her cryptic warnings about Flight 2891 would trigger a chain of events that would leave the entire aviation industry reeling. As they sat waiting for permission to deplane, they were actually sitting at the edge of one of the biggest aviation security revelations in recent history. In a brightly lit conference room at Denver International Airport, the woman sat across from 3 federal agents, her hands wrapped around an untouched cup of coffee. The steam had long since stopped rising from the cup, but she hadn't seemed to notice. Her eyes were fixed on the laptop one of the agents had opened. "Let me show you what we found," she said, her voice steady now. She reached for the laptop, and after a moment's hesitation, the lead agent nodded. Her fingers flew across the keyboard with practiced precision, pulling up screens of data that looked like gibberish to the untrained eye. "I'm the head analyst at ByteShield Security," she explained, her professional demeanor a stark contrast to her earlier behavior on the plane. 3 days ago, our systems detected something unusual in airline booking patterns. She paused, bringing up a complex graph. At first, it looked like normal traffic, but then we noticed this. The agents leaned forward as she highlighted seemingly random passenger bookings across multiple flights. But when she overlaid them with a special program, a pattern emerged. One of the younger agents let out a low whistle. That's not random at all, is it? Meanwhile, in another room, technology experts were poring over the woman's phone. What they found made them immediately alert their superiors. Her device contained dozens of encrypted messages, all pointing to a massive security breach in multiple airlines' booking systems. Back in the conference room, the woman's revelation continued. Someone has been manipulating passenger lists, inserting specific people onto specific flights. We don't know who they are or what they're planning, but the pattern is clear. They're building towards something big. The lead agent's phone buzzed. As he read the message, his face grew serious. We've just confirmed your identity and credentials. Why didn't you just report this through official channels? She laughed, but there was no humor in it. I tried. For 2 days straight, I tried every official channel I could think of. But our warnings kept getting blocked or lost in bureaucratic red tape. When I saw the pattern emerging for Flight 2891, I knew I couldn't wait any longer. I had to do something drastic. Outside the airport, news vans had begun to gather. Word had leaked about an incident involving a diverted flight, but no one yet knew the full story. Reporters stood in front of cameras, speculating about terrorism or mechanical failures, while behind the scenes, a much more complex story was unfolding. The investigation team expanded quickly. Computer specialists were called in from various agencies. The woman's colleagues at Byte Shield were contacted, confirming everything she'd said. Each piece of evidence they uncovered pointed to a sophisticated operation that had been hiding in plain sight. Look at this, she said, pointing to another screen. These aren't just random passengers being moved around. Each one has a specific skill set. It's specialists, security experts, people with military backgrounds. Someone is deliberately gathering them all in one place. One of the agents stepped out to make a call, his face tense. When he returned, the atmosphere in the room had shifted. Flight 2891, he said grimly. You were right. We found irregularities in the passenger list. Multiple identities that don't check out. The woman slumped in her chair, relief washing over her face. Thank God, she whispered. There's still time then. The agent nodded, already reaching for his phone to make another call. As the afternoon wore on, the small conference room became the center of an expanding investigation. More agents arrived, phones rang constantly, and screens displayed flight data from across the country. What had started as one woman's desperate action on a plane was rapidly evolving into one of the largest aviation security investigations in recent history. The woman stayed at the center of it all, explaining complex technical details in terms the agents could understand, helping them see the patterns she'd discovered. Every few minutes, she'd glance at her watch, knowing that somewhere in the sky, Flight 2891 was still heading toward its destination, carrying passengers who had no idea they were part of something much bigger and more dangerous than a routine flight. The tension in the airport conference room peaked as the woman pulled up one final screen on her laptop. The faces of the federal agents reflected the blue glow of the monitor as they leaned in closer. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the Rocky Mountains in shades of purple and gold, but nobody in the room noticed. Here's what forced my hand this morning, she said, her voice slightly hoarse from hours of explanation. I was at my hotel near O'Hare, running one last system check before my flight home. That's when I saw it. Her fingers tapped a few keys, bringing up a complex diagram of interconnected flights. The lead agent rubbed his tired eyes. Walk us through it one more time. Why this particular flight? Around the room, other agents had stopped their phone calls and conversations, all attention focused on her explanation. She took a deep breath. Flight 2891 isn't just another compromised flight. It's the culmination of something that's been building for months. She pulled up passenger manifests from dozens of flights, dates spanning back several weeks. See these patterns? They've been testing the system, probing for weaknesses. But Flight 2891, it's different. One of the tech specialists who'd been analyzing her data spoke up from the corner. She's right. The passenger list for 2891 is like nothing we've seen before. We've identified at least 12 passengers with falsified credentials, all with very specific skill sets. The woman nodded. Expert hackers, security specialists, former military personnel, all carefully arranged to be on this one flight. When I saw the final passenger list come through this morning, I realized we couldn't wait any longer. But every time I tried to send a warning, it was blocked. Someone has deep access to the airline's communication systems. She pulled up another screen showing hundreds of blocked emails and failed communication attempts. That's when I knew I had to do something drastic. I booked myself on the first flight I could find that would require an emergency landing at a major hub. I needed to get the attention of law enforcement in a way that couldn't be ignored or blocked. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. One of the younger agents whistled softly. You deliberately caused a scene on your flight, knowing you'd be arrested, just to get this information to us in person. She smiled tiredly. It wasn't my first choice. But when you realize lives are at stake and every official channel is compromised, you do what you have to do. Just then, a door burst open, and another agent rushed in, slightly out of breath. We just got confirmation from Chicago. Flight 2891 has been grounded. Security teams are moving in now. The tension in the room broke like a wave, several agents letting out sighs of relief. The lead agent's phone rang. As he listened, his expression grew increasingly serious. He put the phone on speaker so everyone could hear. Initial sweep of the grounded aircraft has found sophisticated surveillance equipment hidden throughout the plane. Looks like they were planning to access the airline's entire security network mid-flight. The woman closed her eyes briefly, months of worry finally showing on her face. If they had succeeded, they would have had access to every major airline's systems. They could have caused chaos across the entire global aviation network. As the implications of what she prevented began to sink in, the atmosphere in the room shifted. The same agents who had viewed her with suspicion hours earlier now looked at her with newfound respect. Her seemingly erratic behavior on the plane had been anything but random. It had been a calculated risk to prevent something far worse. Outside the conference room, the airport continued its normal operations. Passengers rushed to make connections, families reunited at arrival gates, and planes took off and landed in their carefully choreographed dance. None of them knew how close they'd come to a massive security breach, or that it had been prevented by one person's desperate gambit. The woman finally reached for her now-cold coffee, her hands shaking slightly. I know I broke protocols and laws today, she said quietly. But when I saw what was about to happen, I couldn't just sit back and watch. Sometimes the only way to do the right thing is to be willing to look like the bad guy. The next few hours unfolded like scenes from a movie, but this was frighteningly real. As evening settled over Denver International Airport, the investigation had spread across multiple terminals. Security teams moved with quiet efficiency, their radios crackling with updates every few minutes. In Chicago, Flight 2891 sat isolated on a remote runway. The passengers had been safely evacuated, though many were confused and frustrated by the sudden destruction to their travel plans. They didn't know that as they waited in the terminal, demanding explanations and compensation, teams of specialists were combing through their plane, making one disturbing discovery after another. Back in Denver, the woman watched live feeds from Chicago on multiple screens. Each new finding validated her actions more thoroughly than the last. There, she pointed, her finger tracing a wire in one of the photos being transmitted. That's not standard aircraft wiring. They've modified the entire communication system. The lead investigator nodded, speaking quietly into his phone. More agents were arriving now, some from agencies whose names they couldn't even mention. The scope of what they'd uncovered was growing by the minute. "We've got another confirmation," called out a young tech analyst from his laptop. 3 more passengers from Flight 2891 had completely fabricated identities. High-quality fakes. They would have passed normal security checks easily. He shook his head in disbelief. They even had digital footprints going back years. The woman wasn't surprised. "That's what we noticed first at Bite Shield, the sophistication of their cover stories. These weren't just fake IDs. These were entirely manufactured lives." She pulled up more data on her screen. "Look at these booking patterns across different airlines over the past 6 months. They were testing the system, seeing how much they could manipulate without raising alarms." In Chicago, the search teams made another discovery. Hidden throughout the aircraft were tiny devices, barely larger than a coin, all connected to the plane's communication systems. One of the tech experts examining them whistled in appreciation. "This is military-grade stuff. They could have accessed every piece of data flowing through the airline's networks." The implications were staggering. With access like that, they could have done anything. Changed flight paths, accessed passenger information, even taken control of other aircraft systems. The entire aviation industry had been standing on the edge of a cliff, and almost no one had noticed. More revelations kept coming. The fake passengers weren't just random choices. Each had been carefully selected to play a specific role. One was supposed to be a systems analyst for a major airline. Another had credentials as a security consultant. Together, they would have had the perfect cover story for accessing restricted areas of the aircraft's systems. In a quiet corner of the Denver airport conference room, the woman finally allowed herself to relax slightly. Her shoulders dropped as the weight of carrying this knowledge alone began to lift. "I kept thinking I was being paranoid," she admitted to one of the agents. "Even this morning, part of me wondered if I was seeing patterns that weren't really there." The agent shook his head. "You weren't paranoid enough. If you hadn't acted." He left the sentence unfinished, but everyone in the room could fill in the blank. The potential disaster they'd avoided was almost too big to comprehend. Outside, the airport continued its normal rhythm of arrivals and departures. Passengers hurried through terminals, worried about making connections or finding their bags. None of them knew how close they'd come to a catastrophe, or that they'd been protected by someone who'd been willing to look crazy to do the right thing. As night fell over Denver, more evidence continued to pour it in. Each new discovery added another piece to the puzzle, revealing a plan so ambitious it was almost impossible to believe. But the proof was there, in the hidden devices, the fake identities, the carefully manipulated booking systems. The woman watched it all unfold, her expression a mix of relief and concern. "They'll try again," she said quietly to no one in particular. "Maybe not the same way, but people with this level of planning, this kind of resources." She didn't need to finish the thought. Everyone in the room knew this was just the beginning of a much larger investigation. 2 weeks after the incident, the woman stood at a podium in a packed conference room at the Department of Transportation headquarters. The faces before her represented every major airline in the country, along with security experts and government officials. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the microphone, but her voice was steady. "What we discovered that day wasn't just a single security breach," she began. "It was a wake-up call for the entire aviation industry." Behind her, screens displayed simplified versions of the data that had first caught her attention. The patterns were clear now, even to untrained eyes. In the audience, she spotted familiar faces: the air marshals from the flight, several of the federal agents who'd interviewed her in Denver, even a few of the passengers from her disrupted flight. Their presence reminded her how far they'd come from that desperate moment when she'd caused a scene at 30,000 feet. The investigation had expanded far beyond that single flight. Teams of experts had spent countless hours tracing the intricate web of compromised systems, fake identities, and manipulated bookings. Each discovery led to another, like pulling threads from an endless sweater. The people behind this weren't just hackers, she explained, clicking to the next slide. They were experts who understood both technology and human nature. They knew exactly how to stay just below the threshold that would trigger automatic alerts. She paused, letting that sink in. They counted on us not seeing the bigger picture. In the 2 weeks since the incident, airlines had begun implementing new security protocols. Booking systems were being redesigned from the ground up. Security checkpoints were adding layers of verification that would have caught the fake identities. But perhaps most importantly, people were learning to trust their instincts when something felt wrong. A young 8 specialist raised his hand during the question period. Weren't you afraid of the consequences when you decided to disrupt that flight? The room fell silent, waiting for her answer. She smiled slightly. Terrified, she admitted. I knew I might lose my job, face criminal charges, or worse, be completely wrong. But I was more afraid of staying silent and reading about a tragedy I could have prevented. The changes rippled beyond just security measures. Airlines were restructuring their communication channels, creating clear pathways for employees to report concerns. The see something, say something policy was being revamped to include digital threats, not just physical ones. After the presentation, in a smaller meeting room, she met with some of the passengers from her original flight. The businessman who had tried to calm her down shook her hand. I thought you were having a breakdown, he admitted. I never imagined. She nodded, understanding. Sometimes the truth was harder to believe than the obvious explanation. The mother with the curious young daughter was there too. My little girl keeps asking if you're a superhero, she said with a laugh. I told her you're something better, someone who did the right thing even when it was hard. Later that evening, as she packed up her materials, the lead investigator from Denver stopped by. The final report goes to Congress next week, he told her. Your actions didn't just prevent a potential disaster. They changed how we think about aviation security in the digital age. She thought about that first moment on the plane, when she'd made the decision to act. How alone she'd felt, how crazy she must have seemed. Now, standing in this room full of people who understood, it felt like a different world. The last person to leave was one of the flight attendants from that day. She paused at the door. You know, in all my years of flying, I've dealt with dozens of disruptive passengers. You're the first one who turned out to be disrupting things for all the right reasons. As she left the building that evening, she looked up at the planes crossing the darkening sky. They looked the same as always, but she knew they were safer now. Sometimes it took one person willing to risk everything to protect strangers they'd never meet. Sometimes the most important moments in life come disguised as our worst moments. In her bag, she carried a new security badge. She'd been appointed to lead a task force on aviation cybersecurity. It turned out that looking crazy for all the right reasons could lead to unexpected opportunities. As another plane soared overhead, she smiled. The sky was a little safer tonight, and tomorrow it would be safer still.